A little girl chained to her bed by a cruel stepmother lived a nightmare no child should ever endure. Her days were marked by darkness and despair, with no hope of escape from her torturous existence. Until one day, when a mysterious millionaire discovered her plight and changed everything in ways no one could have imagined. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Sophie Reynolds lay motionless on the narrow bed, her small frame barely making an impression on the worn mattress. The cold metal shackle around her ankle bit into her skin, its chain rattling softly whenever she shifted position. The iron bedpost it was attached to stood like a silent sentinel, unmoved by the 8-year-old's silent tears. Outside her window, maple leaves danced in the autumn breeze, a freedom she could only watch from her prison. "Dinner will be at 6, Clarissa Reynolds announced, her voice clipped and precise as she smoothed invisible wrinkles from her designer blouse. "Don't make noise." The stepmother's heels clicked across the hardwood floor, each step measured and deliberate. The lock turned with a heavy click that echoed through the room like a gunshot. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway began its hourly chime, the sound penetrating the thick oak door. Sophie counted each resonant tone. 5 o'clock. One more hour until her meager meal would arrive. One more hour of solitude in a day filled with nothing else. "Please," she whispered into the gathering shadows, "please, let someone find me." Her voice was so soft it barely disturbed the dust motes floating in the single shaft of sunlight that managed to penetrate the heavy curtains. The child had learned early, but loud cries brought swift punishment. 3 miles away, Maple Falls bustled with its evening routines. Shopkeepers locked their doors, families gathered for dinner, and neighbors exchanged pleasantries across picket fences. The quaint Vermont town prided itself on its close-knit community and historic charm. American flags fluttered from porches, and seasonal wreaths adorned front doors. Mrs. Henderson watered her prized roses next door to the Reynolds colonial house on Elm Street, pausing to admire the immaculate exterior. The ivy-covered walls concealed their secrets well. "Such a lovely home," she often remarked to her husband, "and Clarissa keeps it so beautifully." No one questioned why they rarely saw the child who supposedly lived there. Clarissa had explanations ready: homeschooling, frequent illnesses, a shy disposition. The town accepted these excuses without question, never imagining the reality behind the polished facade. Inside her room, Sophie traced patterns on the ceiling with her eyes, counting cracks she'd memorized months ago. Her school books lay untouched on a shelf, props in Clarissa's elaborate deception. Mr. Darnell, her supposed homeschool teacher, submitted reports without ever seeing her. The girl's world had shrunk to these 4 walls, her existence slowly being erased from memory and record. As darkness fell over Maple Falls, Sophie curled into herself, the chain clinking softly against the bedframe. Tomorrow would be the same, and the day after, and the day after that, unless someone noticed her absence from the world. Grant Kingsley sat alone in the small conference room of Maple Falls Elementary, surrounded by stacks of scholarship applications. Outside the window, Vermont's autumn painted the trees in fiery hues, but his attention remained fixed on the papers before him. His tech fortune had given him the means to help children in need, and he took this responsibility seriously. "This one doesn't feel right," he muttered, setting aside an application with Sophie's name printed neatly at the top. Grant had reviewed hundreds of these forms over the years, and his instincts, the same ones that had built his tech empire, were sending warning signals. The letter was technically perfect, too perfect. While other 8-year-olds submitted applications with crayon drawings and endearing spelling mistakes, Sophie's submission read like a corporate memo. The vocabulary was advanced, the handwriting meticulous, and the tone eerily formal for a child. "Mr. Kingsley, can I get you anything else?" The school secretary poked her head in. "Actually, yes," he replied, holding up the application. "Do you know this student, Sophie?" The secretary's smile faltered slightly. "Sweet little thing. Rarely see her these days. Her stepmother, Clarissa, switched her to homeschooling last year. Very private family." Grant nodded, filing away this information. After the secretary left, his sister had always been his moral compass, especially when it came to children. Having survived their own difficult childhood, they shared a heightened sensitivity to signs of trouble. "Send it over," she said after hearing his concerns. That evening, in his spacious mansion overlooking the town, Grant spread Sophie's application on his desk alongside other documents from Maple Falls Elementary. His former FBI consultant had already begun a discreet background check on the family. "Something's not right here," Grant said to himself, staring at Sophie's school photo. A small, gentle face looked back at him, eyes holding something he recognized all too well: the quiet resignation of a child who had learned to expect nothing. He thought of the colonial house on Elm Street, where Sophie lived with her stepmother. From the outside, it was picture perfect, just like the application. But Grant had built his fortune by seeing beyond facades, by finding the flaws in seemingly flawless systems. Tomorrow, he would dig deeper. Something about this child's situation demanded attention, and the carefully worded letter had just created the first crack in whatever truth Clarissa was hiding behind those ivy-covered walls. Sophie's world shattered the day her biological mother vanished without a trace. The 8-year-old remembered that Tuesday morning with painful clarity. Her mother had packed her lunch, kissed her forehead, and promised to pick her up after school. That was the last time Sophie ever saw her. The authorities conducted searches throughout Maple Falls, but as weeks turned into months, the case grew cold, leaving only questions and a hollow ache in the little girl's chest. Her father, Robert, fell apart completely. Once a vibrant, engaged parent who built pillow forts and read bedtime stories, he became a shell of himself, haunted, distant, and eventually unable to face the home that held so many memories. When a job opportunity arose overseas, Robert made what he believed was the responsible choice, leaving Sophie with her stepmother Clarissa while he worked abroad to provide financially. "She'll be in good hands," he had assured Sophie, his eyes not quite meeting hers as he packed his suitcase. "Clarissa will take care of everything until I return." What Robert couldn't see through his grief was the calculating gleam in Clarissa's eyes. The moment his plane departed American soil, her transformation began. The woman who had charmed her way into their family with homemade meals and thoughtful gestures revealed her true nature with frightening efficiency. First came the security measures. Clarissa changed the locks, disconnected the landline, and explained to neighbors that Sophie was beginning homeschooling due to emotional fragility following her mother's disappearance. The community of Maple Falls, ever respectful of privacy, nodded sympathetically and kept their distance from the colonial house on Elm Street. Within weeks, Sophie's entire world contracted to the walls of her home. Her bicycle disappeared from the garage. Her playdate invitations went unanswered. Mr. Darnell, her teacher, received elaborately forged medical documentation explaining Sophie's extended absence. "Your father wants you to focus on healing," Clarissa would say, her voice honey-sweet while her eyes remained cold as Vermont winter. "The outside world is simply too much for a sensitive child like you." Sophie's attempts to reach her father were intercepted. Clarissa controlled every phone call, standing close enough to hear every word, her manicured nails digging into Sophie's shoulder when the child tried to communicate her distress. "Daddy, I miss," Sophie would begin, only to feel those nails press deeper. "We're doing wonderfully," Clarissa would interject smoothly. "Sophie is just tired today." Day by day, the isolation grew more complete. Sophie's existence faded from the community's consciousness. her absence explained away by Clarissa's web of plausible lies. No visitors, no friends, no connection to the outside world. Only the growing darkness of a house where a little girl was slowly disappearing, just like her mother before her. Grant Kingsley couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with Sophie's scholarship application. The letter sat on his mahogany desk, its perfect penmanship and adult vocabulary completely at odds with what an 8-year-old should produce. After 20 years building tech companies, Grant had developed a sixth sense for inconsistencies, and this one screamed danger. "I need everything you can find on Sophie and her family," he told Marcus Reynolds, the former SBI consultant who now handled security for Grad's foundation. Marcus nodded, understanding the urgency in his employer's voice. Within days, Marcus delivered a troubling report. Sophie hadn't attended Maple Falls Elementary for nearly 6 months, despite being officially registered. Her homeschooling records looked pristine, too pristine, with documentation signed by a Dr. Wilson, whose credentials couldn't be verified. "The stepmother, Clarissa, has cultivated quite the reputation in town," Marcus explained, sliding photographs across the desk. "Charity committees, church fundraisers, the works. Nobody questions her." Grant studied the images of the immaculately dressed woman, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. And the father? Working overseas, oil consultant, barely communicates with the school. The tech millionaire spent afternoons parked discreetly near the Colonial House on Elm Street, noting that Sophie never played outside. Neighbors confirmed they hadn't seen the child in months, though Clarissa regularly mentioned Sophie's delicate health requiring privacy. When Grant approached Sophie's former teacher, Mrs. Hendricks, her discomfort was palpable. "I'm not supposed to discuss students," she whispered, glancing around the empty teacher's lounge. "But that child used to come in with the saddest eyes I've ever seen. Then one day she just... stopped coming." The final piece fell into place when Marcus discovered medical records showing 3 emergency room visits in 2 years, all with different explanations for identical injuries. The hospital had flagged concerns, but Clarissa's social standing and explanations had somehow sufficed. On a bitter October evening, with Vermont's autumn chill settling into his bones, Grant stood before the Colonial House. Its windows glowed amber against the darkness. Ivy crawling across brick, like nature trying to reclaim something corrupted. Behind him, Marcus waited in the car with equipment and documentation. Grant adjusted his coat and approached the door, heart pounding. He wasn't just a businessman anymore, or even just a philanthropist. Tonight, he was something else entirely. Perhaps the only person willing to look beyond Maple Falls' picturesque facade to the horror he suspected lay within. His finger pressed the doorbell, its chime echoing inside. Whatever darkness waited behind that door, Grant was determined to bring it into the light. Grant Kingsley's heart plummeted as he pushed open the bedroom door. The dim light from the hallway spilled across the small figure on the bed. Sophie, her thin ankle bound by an iron shackle that connected to the bedpost with a heavy chain. Her eyes, wide with fear, locked onto his, then quickly darted away as if human contact itself was dangerous. "It's okay," Grant whispered, fighting to keep his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "I'm not going to hurt you." The 8-year-old girl curled tighter into herself, her small body trembling beneath a threadbare blanket. The room was sparse. No toys, no books, nothing to suggest a child lived here. Just bare walls, a metal bed frame, and those horrific chains that clinked softly when Sophie moved. Grant wanted nothing more than to rush forward, break those shackles, and carry her away from this nightmare. But years of business strategy had taught him that impulse rarely served justice. Evidence would be crucial to ensure Clarissa never harmed Sophie again. "My name is Grant," he said softly, maintaining his distance. "I received your letter at the school." A flicker of recognition crossed Sophie's face, but she remained silent, watching him with the wary eyes of someone who'd learned that hope was dangerous. The tech millionaire took a slow, steadying breath. His hands shook with barely contained fury as he cataloged every detail. The worn mattress, the single water glass on the nightstand, the lack of proper clothing. Each element told a story of systematic cruelty that the polished exterior of this colonial house in Maple Falls had hidden from neighbors and authorities alike. "I need to step out for just a moment," Grant explained, "but I'm coming back for you, I promise." He backed into the hallway, closing the door partway, but ensuring it wouldn't lock. His former FBI consultant waited in the shadows, expression grim. "It's worse than we thought," Grant whispered, his voice breaking. "She's chained like an animal." The investigator nodded, already activating the team waiting outside. "We'll need documentation, photographs, video evidence. Then we contact authorities." Grant leaned against the wall, trembling with a mixture of horror and determination. Through the crack in the door, he could see Sophie watching, her eyes reflecting a cautious glimmer that might have been hope. "How long will it take?" he asked. 24 hours for complete surveillance. We need to document Clarissa's treatment pattern." Grant nodded, knowing that one more day of suffering for Sophie meant a lifetime of freedom afterward. "Tell the team to move quickly. That child has waited long enough." Grant Kingsley sat in his parked car across from the colonial house on Elm Street, his eyes fixed on the upstairs window where he knew Sophie was imprisoned. The tech millionaire's hands trembled slightly as he checked his smartphone one last time before giving the signal. "We're ready," he whispered to the former FBI consultant beside him. "How long will the installation take?" 20 minutes, tops, the investigator replied, adjusting his cap. "Clarissa's book club meets every Wednesday for 3 hours. We'll be in and out before she returns." They had meticulously planned this operation after discovering the horrifying truth about 8-year-old Sophie's captivity. Grant couldn't shake the image of the small child chained to her bed, her eyes hollow with resignation. The memory fueled his determination. The consultant moved silently through the back entrance, using the key they had duplicated from the gardener's set. Inside, he worked with practiced efficiency, installing miniature cameras in Sophie's room, the hallway, and the main living areas. Each device was virtually undetectable, hidden in smoke detectors, picture frames, and even a teddy bear Grant had purchased specifically for this purpose. Meanwhile, in her locked room, Sophie traced patterns in the dust on her windowsill, unaware that freedom was being engineered just feet away. She flinched at the sound of footsteps in the hallway, but relaxed when no key turned in the lock. The iron shackle around her ankle had rubbed her skin raw, but she had learned not to cry about it anymore. Back in his vehicle, Grant monitored the feeds as they came online. The first clear image of Sophie made his throat tighten. She sat alone, humming quietly to herself, creating an imaginary world with her fingers dancing across the bedspread. "We've got audio," the consultant confirmed, adjusting the settings on his device. "Everything she says, everything that happens in that room, it's all being recorded now." Over the next 3 days, the evidence mounted relentlessly. The recordings captured Clarissa's cold cruelty in high definition. Meals withheld as punishment, verbal abuse whispered through clenched teeth, and the methodical isolation of a child from the world. "Is it enough?" Grant asked on the 3rd night, his face illuminated by the screen, showing Sophie attempting to stretch her leg against the restraint. The consultant nodded grimly. "More than enough. We've documented 47 separate instances of abuse and neglect. The prosecutor will have everything needed for an airtight case." Grant closed his eyes briefly. "Then tomorrow," he said, his voice steady with resolve. "Tomorrow we get her out." The night air hung heavy as Grant Kingsley and his former FBI consultant approached the colonial house on Elm Street. With irrefutable evidence collected over 2 weeks, they no longer needed to wait. Grant's heart hammered against his ribs as police officers flanked them, warrant in hand. The doors splintered under their force. Clarissa appeared at the top of the stairs, her immaculate appearance betrayed by wide, panicked eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, voice brittle with fury. "We know about Sophie," Grant said simply. While officers detained the stepmother, Grant rushed upstairs, following the path he'd memorized from surveillance footage. The locked door gave way easily under his shoulder. Inside, 8-year-old Sophie cowered on her bed, ankle still bound by the iron shackle. Her small face registered disbelief, then fragile hope. "You're safe now," Grant whispered, kneeling beside her. The child trembled as paramedics gently freed her ankle, revealing raw, reddened skin beneath. She didn't speak, only watched with enormous eyes as her world transformed in minutes. Outside, neighbors gathered on their porches, murmuring in shock as Clarissa was escorted to a police vehicle. The woman maintained rigid composure, chin lifted defiantly. "This is a misunderstanding," she announced to anyone within earshot. "That man has no right to interfere with my family." Within hours, Sophie was settled at Pinewood, a private wellness facility nestled in the Vermont countryside. Grant had arranged everything: a team of trauma specialists, round-the-clock security, and a sunny room overlooking gardens. The tech millionaire secured temporary emergency guardianship through connections and resources that Clarissa could only dream of challenging. "She'll need time," Dr. Alcott advised, watching Sophie curl into herself on the new bed, refusing to touch the untethered freedom of her ankle. "Her world has been defined by captivity. Freedom will feel foreign, even frightening." Meanwhile, in a borrowed office at her attorney's practice, Clarissa was crafting her defense. "He's obsessed with her," she insisted, pacing the room in her designer heels. "A wealthy man with no children of his own, suddenly fixated on my stepdaughter? The town knows me. They'll see through this." Her lawyer looked skeptical, but nodded. "We'll focus on your standing in the community, question his motives, suggest he's unstable." Clarissa's lips curved into a cold smile. She'd built her life on manipulation and control. She wouldn't relinquish Sophie without deploying every weapon in her arsenal. Already, she was making calls to sympathetic neighbors, planting seeds of doubt about Grant's character and intentions. Back at Pinewood, Sophie slept for 14 hours straight, her small body finally relaxing in safety. Grant watched over her, unaware that across town, Clarissa was spinning a web that would soon ensnare them both in a vicious battle for public opinion and Sophie's future. "Maple Falls millionaire accused of child snatching," screamed the headline of the Maple Falls Gazette. Clarissa Montgomery stood on the courthouse steps, dabbing at her eyes with a pristine handkerchief. Reporters crowded around, microphones thrust forward as she delivered a performance worthy of Hollywood. "That man took my daughter," she said, her voice breaking perfectly. "Grant Kingsley may have millions, but that doesn't give him the right to become obsessed with an innocent child who isn't his." Within 48 hours, Clarissa had transformed from abuser to victim in the public eye. Her carefully cultivated image as a pillar of the community, the woman who organized charity bake sales and sat on 3 town committees, gave her words unquestioned credibility. Local television stations ran special segments questioning the tech millionaire's motives, while coffee shops buzzed with speculation. "Always seemed odd, that Kingsley fellow," muttered one elderly patron at Maple's Corner Cafe. "Living alone in that big mansion. Now suddenly interested in a little girl? Makes you wonder." Grant watched the news coverage from his home office, his jaw clenched tight. His former FBI consultant advised against making public statements that could jeopardize their case. But the damage to his reputation spread like wildfire through the small Vermont town. "We expected this," the investigator reminded him. "Clarissa's using the town's culture against us." Indeed, Maple Falls had always prided itself on discretion and privacy. Neighbors didn't pry, and family matters remained behind closed doors. The very social contract that had allowed Sophie's abuse to continue undetected for so long. Now that same culture was being weaponized, painting Grant as an outsider disrupting the natural order. Clarissa visited 3 different churches that Sunday, accepting sympathetic hugs and promises of prayer. She spoke tearfully about her stepdaughter's special needs that required her constant care, needs that Grant couldn't possibly understand. When Grant attempted to take Sophie to a doctor's appointment, photographers appeared, snapping pictures that Clarissa's lawyer later described as a disturbing pattern of public appearances. The spotlight burned uncomfortably on Sophie, who shrank from the attention, clutching Grant's hand tightly. "Is this what freedom feels like?" she whispered, her small face pinched with worry. Vanessa arrived that evening, bringing dinner and determination. "The truth will outlast the gossip," she assured her brother. "Focus on Sophie, not the noise." But as Grant watched Clarissa's carefully orchestrated media campaign unfold, he realized this battle would be fought not just in courtrooms, but in the court of public opinion, a battlefield where Clarissa had spent years preparing her defenses, and where Sophie's whispered truths might be drowned out by a town that preferred comfortable lies. Sophie stood at the window of her room at the wellness facility, her small fingers hovering over the latch. She turned around, eyes searching for someone to ask permission. Can I open it?" she whispered to Miss Alcott, who sat nearby with a gentle smile. "Of course you can, Sophie. This is your space now," the therapist replied, careful not to move too quickly or speak too loudly. The 8-year-old's face registered confusion before she tentatively pushed the window open. The cool Vermont breeze rushed in, carrying the scent of maple trees. Sophie closed her eyes, savoring this simple freedom that had been denied for so long. Each day brought new challenges as the child navigated a world without chains. When offered a choice between a blue sweater and a green one, she froze, her breathing quickening. Making decisions had consequences in Clarissa's house. Choosing wrong meant punishment. "There's no wrong choice here," Miss Alcott assured her, noting the panic in Sophie's eyes. "You can try both if you'd like." The therapist documented these moments meticulously, building a case study of trauma that would later prove invaluable in court. During their sessions, Sophie would often glance toward the door, as if expecting her stepmother to appear and drag her back to that colonial house on Elm Street. Grant visited 3 times weekly, always bringing small gifts, colored pencils, a stuffed animal, picture books. He never stayed too long, understanding that Sophie needed space to heal. "Will I have to go back?" she asked him one afternoon, her voice barely audible. The tech millionaire knelt to her level. "No, Sophie. You're safe now." But safety felt foreign to her. At night she would wake screaming, her ankle burning with phantom pain where the iron shackle had been. The facility staff would find her huddled in corners rather than in bed, as if punishing herself before someone else could. "Recovery isn't linear, Miss Alcott explained to Grant during a private consultation. "Sophie has been conditioned to expect cruelty. Kindness feels like a trap to her, something that will be withdrawn without warning." Progress came in tiny increments. Sophie ate a full meal without asking if she was allowed more food. She ventured into the facility's garden without looking over her shoulder. She drew a picture of herself without chains. But still, she kept her voice low, her movements small, her hopes guarded. Freedom was a language Sophie was just beginning to learn, and trust remained a distant shore she could barely see through the fog of her trauma. While the legal battle raged on, Grant Kingsley's team made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in the back of an antique desk drawer in the colonial house on Elm Street, sealed with yellowed tape and tucked beneath layers of old receipts, they found a leather-bound journal belonging to Sophie's biological mother. The journal's pages were filled with elegant, increasingly frantic handwriting. "Clarissa suggested I see Dr. Winters again today," one entry read. "She keeps telling Robert I seem unstable. When I confronted her, she smiled and said I was imagining things. But I know what I heard." As Grant turned each page, his stomach tightened. The journal documented 3 years of subtle manipulation, gaslighting, and psychological warfare waged by Clarissa against Sophie's mother. "She's slowly isolating me from Robert," another entry revealed. "And the way she looks at Sophie sometimes, it terrifies me. I've started keeping this journal because I'm afraid no one will believe me otherwise." The final entries became more desperate, describing missing medication, unexplained dizzy spells, and growing fears for Sophie's safety. Ms. Alcott reviewed the journal with professional detachment that barely masked her horror. "This documents classic psychological abuse patterns," she told Grant. Sophie's mother was systematically undermined and isolated. These entries suggest Clarissa had been planning this for years before the mother's disappearance. The former FBI consultant carefully authenticated the handwriting against known samples, confirming its legitimacy. "This isn't just evidence of past abuse," he explained. "It establishes a pattern that directly connects to Sophie's current situation." When Grant showed the journal to Vanessa, tears welled in her eyes. "This poor woman knew something was wrong, but couldn't stop it," she whispered. "Just like Sophie." The journal transformed the legal landscape. Grant's attorneys presented it to the judge, who ordered it sealed as evidence, but acknowledged its significance. For the first time, Clarissa's carefully constructed facade began to crumble publicly. Her attorney's dismissal of the journal as creative fiction from a troubled woman only strengthened the parallel between how both mother and daughter had been discredited. Sophie, when gently told about the journal, asked only one question: "Did my mom try to protect me?" Grant knelt beside her and nodded. "With everything she had," he answered softly. The journal became the thread that, when pulled, began to unravel Clarissa's entire web of deception. What had begun as Grant's instinctive concern for a child was now supported by a mother's desperate documentation of the darkness she had sensed gathering around her family. Thomas Darnell sat across from Grant Kingsley in the small conference room, his hands trembling as he clutched a manila folder containing Sophie's falsified homeschool records. The teacher's face was ashen, eyes rimmed with sleepless nights and the weight of his complicity. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered, sliding the folder across the table. "For 2 years, I signed off on educational assessments for Sophie that never happened. Not once did I actually see or evaluate her." Grant leaned forward, careful to keep his expression neutral despite the rage building inside him. "Why?" he asked simply. The educator ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Clarissa threatened to expose an affair I had with a colleague years ago. My marriage, my career, everything would have been destroyed." His voice cracked. "I told myself Sophie was probably fine, just shy. But deep down, I knew something was wrong when Clarissa wouldn't even let me speak to her on the phone." Thomas described how Clarissa had systematically removed Sophie from all social contact, creating elaborate excuses for her absence at school functions and community events. She would provide perfectly completed assignments in Sophie's handwriting, work that showed no educational gaps, but also no personality or mistakes typical of an 8-year-old. "She handed me these packets monthly," he explained, opening the folder to reveal meticulously organized worksheets. "The handwriting changes subtly over time. I now believe Clarissa forced Sophie to copy work she had prepared." The former FBI consultant, working with Grant, photographed each document while Thomas continued his confession. "The last time I pressed to actually see Sophie, Clarissa mentioned knowing about my elderly mother's medication needs and how tragic it would be if something disrupted her care." His eyes filled with tears. "I was a coward." Grant placed a steady hand on the man's shoulder. "You're here now. That's what matters." The teacher straightened his posture. "I'll testify. Whatever it costs me, I'll tell everything I know." This testimony became the turning point in Sophie's case. Thomas Darnell's detailed account of educational neglect and Clarissa's systematic isolation techniques shattered her carefully constructed facade. The court was particularly disturbed by evidence that Sophie had been denied not just freedom, but fundamental educational rights. For Grant, the teacher's confession provided a crucial ally, someone from within Maple Falls' tight-knit community willing to stand against one of their own. For Sophie, it was validation that adults were finally seeing the truth and choosing to protect her, even at personal cost. As Thomas left the courthouse after giving his sworn statement, he passed Clarissa in the hallway. For the first time in years, he didn't lower his eyes. The grand ballroom at the Maple Falls Hotel shimmered with candlelight as Grant Kingsley's charity gala reached its emotional pinnacle. The tech millionaire had spared no expense, transforming the venue into a sanctuary of hope, with white lilies and blue ribbons representing child advocacy. The crowd, a mix of local dignitaries, media, and carefully selected guests, fell silent as Grant approached the microphone. "Tonight is not about me," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "It's about giving voice to those who have been silenced." Sophie stepped onto the small stage, her new dress catching the light. 8 years old and still painfully thin, she clutched a piece of paper that trembled visibly in her small hands. Miss Alcott stood nearby, offering a reassuring nod as the child approached the microphone that Grant adjusted to her height. "My name is Sophie," she began, her voice barely audible at first. The room leaned forward collectively, straining to hear. "This is called The Bird Who Found Her Wings." As she read, her voice grew stronger with each line. The poem spoke of darkness, of chains both real and invisible, of windows that couldn't open and skies she could only imagine. But then it transformed, speaking of kind hands that unlock doors, of learning to trust the ground beneath her feet, of discovering that her voice, unused for so long, could still sing. "And now I fly," she finished, "not because someone carries me, but because these wings were always mine." For 3 heartbeats, the ballroom remained in perfect silence. Then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted. Women dabbed at mascara-streaked cheeks. Men cleared their throats roughly. Even the stoic former FBI consultant, standing guard near the exit, blinked rapidly against unexpected emotion. The local news crews, initially skeptical of Grant's motives, captured every moment. By morning, Sophie's poem would lead broadcasts across Vermont, her words transcending the specific details of her case to highlight a universal truth about suffering and resilience. Vanessa peered at her brother's side, squeezing his hand. "You didn't rescue her," she whispered. "You just gave her a chance to rescue herself." As the evening progressed, 3 town council members approached Grant privately, requesting meetings to discuss new child welfare protocols. The school superintendent, who had initially defended the system that failed Sophie, publicly pledged a complete overhaul of absence monitoring. Maple Falls, with its picturesque colonial homes and carefully maintained appearances, could no longer pretend that darkness didn't exist behind some of its doors. Sophie's trembling voice had accomplished what legal documents and accusations couldn't. It had pierced the town's collective conscience. And in the corner, watching it all unfold, Sophie stood a little taller, feeling the weight of the chains fade with each person who truly heard her. The Maple Falls courthouse buzzed with tension as Clarissa Mitchell filed her defamation lawsuit against Grant Kingsley. Her attorney, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that matched her client's polished appearance, presented the case with practiced indignation. Clarissa dabbed at non-existent tears while describing how the tech millionaire had destroyed her reputation and traumatized her stepdaughter with false accusations. Grant sat stoically at the defense table, his shoulders squared despite the weight pressing down on them. The courtroom, with its polished oak and stern-faced judge, felt suffocating. His attorney leaned over, whispering something that made him nod grimly. The stakes couldn't be higher. Sophie's future hung in the balance. "Your Honor," Clarissa's lawyer continued, My client has been a pillar of this community for years. Mr. Kingsley is an outsider with deep pockets and a vendetta. What troubled Grant most wasn't the lawsuit itself, but the mysterious funding behind it. Clarissa's sudden access to top-tier legal representation raised questions his team was frantically investigating. The answer came 3 days later. The money traced back to Maxwell Thornton, Grant's former business rival who'd lost millions when Grant's startup outperformed his own. "He's using her to get to you," Vanessa told her brother over dinner at his home. She pushed her food around her plate, concern etching lines around her eyes. "Max never forgave you for that Silicon Valley deal." The legal system's bias toward biological connections complicated matters further. Despite the evidence of abuse, the court seemed reluctant to permanently sever Sophie's ties to her only remaining parental figure. The judge, an older man with traditional values, repeatedly emphasized family reunification during preliminary hearings. Meanwhile, Sophie remained at the wellness facility, working with Ms. Alcott through her trauma while the adults battled over her future. The therapist reported that the 8-year-old drew pictures of chains breaking whenever court dates approached, her anxiety manifesting in crayon and colored pencil. The town of Maple Falls itself seemed to take sides. Longtime residents who'd known Clarissa for years couldn't reconcile the charming socialite with the monster Grant described. At the local diner, conversations hushed when either party entered. The uncomfortable truth that evil could hide behind perfect makeup and community volunteering threatened the town's sense of security. "Appearances matter here," the former FBI consultant warned Grant after interviewing reluctant witnesses. "This community protects its own, even when the evidence suggests they shouldn't." Grant stared out the courthouse window at the Vermont autumn, leaves turning brilliant red like warning signals. He knew the battle ahead would be brutal. But looking at the photograph of Sophie on his smartphone, the first genuine smile she'd managed since her rescue, he knew no cost was too high. The courtroom fell silent as Grant's legal team unveiled the extent of Clarissa's deception. Financial records projected onto the screen revealed how she had systematically exploited Sophie's identity to claim thousands in government benefits meant for the child's welfare. "Your Honor," the former FBI consultant explained, pointing to highlighted transactions, "these funds never benefited Sophie. Instead, they were diverted to Clarissa's personal accounts and luxury purchases while the child remained malnourished and neglected." More damning still were the documents exposing Sophie's Sunshine Foundation, a fraudulent nonprofit Clarissa had established supposedly to help vulnerable children. Bank statements showed donations from well-meaning Maple Falls residents flowing directly into her private accounts. The jury visibly recoiled when shown photographs of Sophie's chained ankle juxtaposed with receipts for Clarissa's spa treatments and designer clothing purchased the same day. "She maintained 2 separate lives," Grant testified, his voice steady despite his obvious disgust. "One as the charitable stepmother in public, another as a tormentor behind closed doors." The courtroom murmured when Clarissa's meticulously forged signatures appeared on screen, perfect replications of Sophie's father's handwriting, authorizing various financial arrangements that benefited only herself. The prosecution's case strengthened further when Edward Winters, who lived 3 houses down on Elm Street, approached the witness stand. The elderly neighbor twisted his hands nervously as he confessed to years of willful blindness. "I saw Sophie at the window once, crying," he admitted, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "When I asked Clarissa about it, she said the child was emotionally disturbed and needed structure. Then she offered to pay my property taxes if I'd keep an eye on her house when she traveled." Edward's voice cracked. "I took the money 5 times, but I couldn't sleep anymore after seeing that little girl's face in the newspaper." Clarissa's attorney attempted to discredit him, suggesting financial motivation for his testimony, but Edward shook his head. "I've donated every cent she gave me to the Real Children's Foundation Mr. Kingsley established," he said firmly. I can't undo my silence, but I can tell the truth now. As the day's proceedings ended, the prosecution had methodically dismantled Clarissa's carefully constructed facade. The woman who had once commanded respect throughout Maple Falls now sat isolated at the defense table, her immaculate appearance contrasting sharply with the ugly truth laid bare before the court. Outside, reporters clustered around Grant, but he declined comment, his thoughts only on Sophie, waiting at the wellness facility with Miss Alcott, finally safe from the woman whose schemes had imprisoned her both physically and financially for so long. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Somehow, several recordings of Sophie's private therapy sessions with Miss Alcott had been leaked online, their intimate conversations now dissected by news outlets across the country. Sophie's trembling voice describing the cold metal against her ankle, her fear of the dark, and her confusion about why Clarissa hated her so much, all exposed for public consumption. "I thought these were just for us," Sophie whispered, curled into herself on the window seat of Grant Kingsley's home. Her small fingers clutched a sketch pad so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Now everyone knows everything!" Grant paced the room, phone pressed to his ear as he demanded answers from his legal team. The 8-year-old's newfound sense of safety had been violated again, this time by the very system meant to protect her. His sister Vanessa sat beside the child, not touching, but present, understanding from her own experience that sometimes proximity was enough. The recordings were accessed through an unauthorized breach of the wellness facility's servers, the former FBI consultant explained later that evening. "We believe someone on Clarissa's side orchestrated this." The leak sparked fierce debate across media platforms. Some commentators questioned whether Sophie's trauma was being exploited, while others argued the recordings prove the severity of her abuse. Hashtags trended, experts weighed in, and through it all, Sophie retreated further into silence. Ms. Alcott arrived the following day, her usual calm demeanor hardened with determination. "This violation doesn't erase our progress," the therapist told Sophie gently. "Sometimes when our stories escape before we're ready to share them, we can still decide what happens next." Together, Vanessa and Ms. Alcott developed a strategy. Rather than hiding from the leak, they helped Sophie craft a simple statement read by Grant's attorney. "Those were my private thoughts. I wasn't ready to share them. Please respect that I am still healing." The statement, coming from a child who had been silenced for so long, resonated powerfully. Several major networks pulled the recordings from their coverage. Parents' groups called for stricter privacy laws protecting vulnerable children. Most surprisingly, other survivors began reaching out, children and adults who recognized their own experiences in Sophie's words. Vanessa, seeing an opportunity, organized a small support group that met virtually, creating a safe space for sharing stories of emotional abuse and recovery. Sometimes, Vanessa told her brother as they watched Sophie sketching peacefully for the first time in days, the worst violations can lead to unexpected healing. The trial continued, but something had shifted. Sophie's private pain had become a catalyst for change, and though she hadn't chosen this exposure, the young girl found herself at the center of a movement larger than herself, one that might protect other children from suffering in silence. The courtroom fell silent as Madeline Chen, Grant Kingsley's lead attorney, approached the bench with 2 documents sealed in evidence bags. The first, a living will, supposedly written by Catherine Walsh, Sophie's biological mother, had been Clarissa's legal shield for years. "Your Honor," Madeline began, "our forensic document examiner has confirmed what we suspected." She placed the will under the document camera, highlighting inconsistencies in the signature. This will, which granted Clarissa Walsh full custody of Sophie upon Catherine's disappearance, is a forgery. Clarissa's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. Her attorney leaned over, whispering urgently, but she shook her head slightly. Grant watched from across the room, his breath caught in his throat. The judge examined the evidence with narrowed eyes, comparing the signature with known samples of Catherine's handwriting. The differences, once pointed out, were unmistakable. Furthermore, Madeline continued, producing the second document, we've recovered this letter, written by Catherine Walsh 3 days before her disappearance. She handed copies to the court. It was discovered in a safety deposit box that Catherine maintained separately from family accounts. The letter, projected onto the courtroom screen, cast a harsh light on years of manipulation. Catherine had detailed her growing concerns about Clarissa's behavior, subtle threats, missing medication, unexplained accidents. Most damning was the final paragraph. If anything happens to me, protect Sophie. Clarissa has systematically isolated me from everyone I love. I fear what she might do next. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The judge removed her glasses, visibly affected by the evidence. Miss Alcott, sitting beside Sophie in the witness preparation room where they watched via closed circuit, placed a gentle hand on the child's shoulder. Your mother tried to protect you, she whispered. Back in the courtroom, Clarissa's attorney attempted damage control, questioning the letter's authenticity and timing. But the bank records confirming Catherine's visit to the safety deposit box 3 days before vanishing silenced these objections. The prosecution moves to enter both documents as evidence, Madeline stated firmly. They establish a pattern of deception that directly contradicts Mrs. Walsh's testimony. The judge nodded gravely. Motion granted. Grant exchanged glances with Vanessa across the courtroom. His sister's eyes held a mixture of vindication and sorrow. They both recognized the familiar pattern of emotional manipulation that had shaped their own childhood. As court adjourned for the day, Grant knew the tide had turned irrevocably. Catherine's voice, silenced for years, had finally broken through Clarissa's web of lies. For Sophie, it meant more than legal victory. It was vindication of a mother's love that had never truly vanished. As the trial entered its final phase, Sophie's world expanded in ways she could never have imagined. The sterile, minimalist mansion that Grant Kingsley called home had undergone a transformation as profound as the little girl herself. What was once a showcase of modern design and untouched surfaces had become a living, breathing sanctuary. Sunlight now streamed through windows once hidden behind heavy drapes. The formal living room had been converted into an art studio, with easels positioned to capture the morning light. Plants adorned every windowsill, ferns, succulents, and flowering orchids that Sophie watered each morning with careful attention. The 8-year-old moved through the house with growing confidence, her footsteps no longer hesitant on the hardwood floors. I made these for you, Sophie said one afternoon, presenting Grant with a plate of slightly misshapen chocolate chip cookies. The kitchen, once a pristine showpiece, now regularly filled with the homey scent of baking. Miss Alcott had suggested cooking as therapy, and the child had embraced it wholeheartedly. Grant took a bite and smiled genuinely. These might be the best cookies I've ever tasted. The transformation extended beyond domestic life. Sophie's artwork, created during therapy sessions with Miss Alcott, had caught the attention of a gallery owner who specialized in children's art. Through an anonymous sponsorship arranged discreetly by Vanessa, Sophie's paintings were featured in a national exhibition called Voices Without Words. Her canvases told stories that words couldn't express. Dark, confined spaces giving way to explosions of color, tiny figures growing wings, chains transformed into flowering vines. Visitors to the exhibition rarely left dry-eyed, though they knew nothing of the artist beyond her first name and age. Your paintings are helping other children, Vanessa explained gently as she helped Sophie prepare for the exhibition opening. Some of them are afraid to speak about their own experiences, but seeing your art gives them courage. The girl nodded solemnly, understanding more than most adults might expect. Her experiences under Clarissa's cruel care had aged her in some ways, while leaving her childlike wonder intact in others. What began as personal healing evolved into something more significant. Sophie started writing messages on the backs of her canvases. Simple words of encouragement for other children trapped in silence. "You are not alone," read one. "Someone will hear you," promised another. As spring approached, Sophie planted a small garden outside her bedroom window. Tangible proof of her growing roots in this new life and her belief in tomorrow. Each seed represented a promise that darkness could give way to light, that what was broken could still grow into something beautiful. Grant Kingsley sat alone in his study, the evening shadows stretching across the hardwood floor. Through the window, he could see Sophie in the garden, carefully tending to the flowers she had planted last month. The sight should have brought him joy, but tonight, memories weighed heavily on his mind. "You're hovering again," Vanessa said, appearing in the doorway with 2 steaming cups of tea. His sister's intuition had always been uncanny. "I'm just making sure she's safe," Grant replied, accepting the cup with a grateful nod. Vanessa settled into the chair opposite him. "The same way our aunt made sure we were safe after Mom died? By controlling every breath we took?" The words struck a nerve. Grant remembered the suffocating rules, the constant surveillance, the way his aunt had claimed every restriction was for their protection. He'd sworn he would never become that person, yet here he was, monitoring Sophie's every move. Sophie asked if she could visit her friend Lily after school tomorrow, he confessed. "I told her I needed to think about it." "And what exactly needs thinking about?" Vanessa challenged gently. "The security team has vetted Lily's family. The house is 15 minutes away. Sophie's therapist says social connections are crucial for her recovery." Grant ran his hand through his hair. "What if something happens? What if Clarissa still has people watching her? What if you let Sophie live?" Vanessa interrupted. "Grant, there's a difference between protection and possession. One heals, the other harms." Outside, Sophie looked up and waved. Grant waved back, his chest tightening with conflicting emotions. "Remember when I wanted to go to art school?" Vanessa continued. "You fought Aunt Margaret for weeks until she let me apply. You told her that keeping me from my dreams wasn't protection. It was another form of cage." The memory washed over him. He'd been 17, standing up to their aunt, insisting that Vanessa deserved choices. Now, 20 years later, his sister was successful, confident, and whole, not despite having choices, but because of them. "Sophie needs the same chance you gave me," Vanessa said softly. "The opportunity to choose, to stumble sometimes, to learn that the world isn't just full of monsters." Grant watched as Sophie collected a small bouquet of flowers, her movements more confident than they had been months ago. He realized then that true guardianship wasn't about building higher walls. It was about teaching her to navigate beyond them. "I'll tell her she can go," he decided, "and I'll ask if she wants me to drive her or if she'd prefer Miss Alcott to take her." Vanessa smiled. "That's my brother. Giving choices, not just protection." For the first time that evening, Grant felt the weight lift from his shoulders. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harrington entered for the final day of proceedings. Grant Kingsley sat rigid beside his attorney, while across the aisle, Clarissa maintained her practiced composure, her hands folded neatly in her lap. 8-year-old Sophie waited in a separate room with Ms. Alcott, spared from witnessing the final confrontation. "Your Honor," Grant's attorney began, "we present the culmination of evidence against Clarissa Wilson." The lawyer methodically displayed enlarged copies of the forged living will, pointing out inconsistencies in handwriting that the forensic analyst had identified. The courtroom murmured as bank statements appeared on screens, showing how Sophie's identity had been used to funnel government benefits into Clarissa's personal accounts. "The defendant not only imprisoned this child physically," the attorney continued, "but systematically erased her existence from public record." Mr. Darnell's testimony was replayed, his voice trembling as he admitted to falsifying educational records under threat. When Dr. Lawrence took the stand, the final piece fell into place. The individual who signed off on Sophie's supposed home health care doesn't exist, he testified. The medical license number belongs to a physician who died 3 years ago. Clarissa's attorney attempted to object, but the evidence was overwhelming. The woman's carefully constructed facade crumbled visibly as the judge reviewed the mother's letter, which directly accused her of manipulation and expressed fears for Sophie's safety. "In all my years on the bench," Judge Harrington said, removing her glasses, "I have rarely seen such calculated cruelty masked by such convincing respectability." The judge addressed Clarissa directly. "You weaponized this community's culture of privacy and politeness. You exploited our tendency to look away from uncomfortable truths." When the time came for the verdict, Sophie was brought in, her small frame dwarfed by the courtroom's grandeur. The judge's voice softened as she announced her decision. Permanent custody is granted to Grant Kingsley, with supervised visitation rights for Sophie's biological father pending his return from abroad. As the gavel fell with finality, Clarissa was led away by court officers. Sophie looked up at Grant, her eyes clear and steady, for perhaps the first time since he'd known her. Without prompting, she reached out her small hand and took his, not clutching desperately as she once might have, but with the deliberate choice of someone reclaiming their agency. "It's over," Grant whispered. Sophie nodded. "I know," she replied, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I chose this." In that moment, the chains that had bound her were truly broken. Not just the physical ones from the bedroom on Elm Street, but the invisible ones that had imprisoned her spirit. The Vermont snow melted into puddles, giving way to tender green shoots pushing through the soil. As spring settled over Maple Falls, the colonial house on Elm Street stood empty, its dark secrets now exposed to daylight. Sophie walked through Grant Kingsley's garden, her small fingers tracing the petals of newly bloomed daffodils. The physical scars around her ankle had faded to pale marks, badges of survival rather than shame. "Look what I found," she called, holding up a robin's feather. Grant smiled from the porch, watching as she carefully added it to her nature collection. Their relationship had evolved from rescuer and victim to something more profound, a family built on choice rather than obligation. Clarissa now faced 20 years behind bars. The evidence had been overwhelming: financial fraud, child abuse, document forgery, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Sophie's mother's disappearance. The town that had once shielded her with its culture of privacy now confronted its complicity in looking away. Miss Alcott visited weekly, guiding Sophie through her continuing healing journey. "Trauma doesn't disappear," the therapist had explained to Grant, "but it can transform." And transform it had. Sophie's experiences now fueled her artwork, paintings that hung in the local gallery, telling stories of darkness and light that moved viewers to tears and action. Vanessa arrived carrying groceries, her presence a steady reminder to her brother that guardianship meant empowerment, not control. The school board approved the new monitoring system, she announced, and mandatory training for all teachers on recognizing signs of abuse. The ripple effects of Sophie's case had changed Maple Falls forever. Monthly town meetings now addressed child welfare concerns openly. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented in schools. Neighbors began checking on one another with genuine care rather than polite distance. That evening, Sophie sat at the dining table completing homework, something that would have been unimaginable months earlier. "I've been invited to speak at the Children's Rights Conference," she said quietly. Grant looked up, surprised. "Are you comfortable with that?" She nodded, her eyes reflecting a confidence that grew stronger each day. "Someone needs to speak for the children who can't." Later, as fireflies began to dance outside the windows, Sophie placed a small handmade card on Grant's desk. Inside, her careful handwriting read, "Thank you for hearing me when I couldn't speak." The millionaire who had once measured success in technology innovations and financial gains now understood its true meaning. It wasn't in the justice they had secured, or even in the policies they had changed. It was in the simple sound of Sophie's laughter floating through open windows. the sound of a little girl who had rewritten her fate.